2. Millennium. Chapter 9. The technomancer staggered backwards as if she had been struck, which she had, although it hadn't been a physical attack. It had been far more insidious than that. Her heart racing, she grabbed one arm of her massive sapphire throne for support and tried to catch her breath. For the briefest of moments, bizarre alien images had flooded her mind, visions of the great kingdom so warped and twisted as to be almost unrecognizable. But most frightening of all had been a fragmented picture of her, divested of both her royal armor and her air of imperious dignity, more like a child than the technomancer, dynastic ruler of 1/3 of the great kingdom. Magistrix. Addressing her in the formal way, the Chancellor rushed forward to help, but the technomancer waved her away. Do not concern yourself, Luella. It was nothing. A brief malaise, no more. She gazed out of the enormous window opposite at the panoramic view of the great kingdom. The window, nothing more than a giant rectangle cut into the staggered side of the ziggurat of Theosophy, afforded an ideal view of the other 2 seats of power with which the ziggurat shared the kingdom. The shining gold tower of Abraxas, its pyramidal roof reflecting the energy discharges which rent the sky above, and the pattern of low, flat squares that marked the underground warren that was the labyrinth of thaumaturgy. The technomancer snapped her fingers and mentally directed an order at one of her cybrids. Within seconds he scuttled up to her, holding a blue-black goblet. She plucked it from his talon and thanked him, watching with a maternal smile as he bounded back to the side of the throne room. And why not? Was she not mother to the cybrids, as the archimage was father to the oryx? And of course that hag, the Hierophant, was she not mother, or grandmother rather, to her twittering, fussing thaumaturgs? Sipping the sweet, heady wine, she continued to stare through the window. It had been countless millennia since the great kingdom had been created by the 3 gods of past, present, and future. They had sealed the kingdom behind the electric blue waterfall of their tears to keep out the barbarians, and placed the 3 citadels to rule in their stead. From the gilded edifice of the tower, the archimage governed his oryx, while the Hierophant skulked in her labyrinth with her thaumaturgs. And the technomancer attended to the needs of her cybrids from the grand palace of her ziggurat. All was as it had been, and would be always. Until now. The technomancer closed her eyes and remembered the unprecedented events of the previous day. Not with the blurred inexactitudes of others, but with the vivid accuracy that her royal blood granted her, she could see the visitor to the ziggurat standing before her. To bring you proof that my words are true, Magistrix. The figure, stooped, cloaked and hooded, had reached into his cloak. 2 of her personal guard of cybrids had leapt forward, but the technomancer had held up her hand to stay them, watching as the stranger held out an object wrapped in white silk. And she had taken it and opened its wrapping, gasping as she did so. Then she had dismissed everyone from the throne room. Cybrids, her Chancellor Luella, and Bartholomew, whose role was a unique mix of court jester and major domo. And as soon as she was alone, she had cast a spell of wards to shield the room from unwanted attention before ordering the stranger to disrobe. Casting off his grey cloak, he had straightened up to reveal his true nature, the nature indicated by the platinum sigil he had presented. He was thin to the point of emaciation, but that was his natural state. And he was tall, at least 7 feet in height, with grey skin, silver hair swept back in a floor-length ponytail, and silver-grey eyes. Bulbous eyes suited to a nocturnal creature. But the most disturbing feature was his complete inability to stay still. His eyes darted around the throne room, while his long, spindly fingers twitched like spiders. It was a thaumaturg, an emissary from the Hierophant. Your mistress dares the wrath of the 3 gods, thaumaturg, the technomancer had whispered. The last time one of your kind entered the ziggurat of Theosophy unbidden, the gods went to war and almost destroyed the kingdom. Then that should be further proof of my mistress's urgency, Magistrix, he had trilled in his reedy voice. She desires that you pluck an image from my mind. Does she now? The technomancer had laughed, a light, bubbly laugh, and then her voice had hardened. And what happens when I reach into your pitiful mind, eh? Has your mistress planted a psychic bomb that will detonate at my touch? She had shaken her head, perhaps just a little too theatrically. Her great-grandfather's reign as Hierophant was renowned for the convenient deaths of the lesser princes. Perhaps he passed on some of his secrets to her. The thaumaturg had twittered even more. But Magistrix, you dismissed your guards and courtesans. If you feared an attack— Silence, fool. I am the technomancer, and my powers are without compare. She had snapped her fingers, and the thaumaturg had reached for his throat, trying to catch a breath while her incantation slowly strangled him. And then the torment had ended, and he had fallen to his knees. Very well, creature of the shadows. I shall trust that your mistress possesses the meagre intelligence with which I credit her, and has not planned to assassinate me, thus urging the anger of the gods. Open your mind so that I can understand your mistress's urgency. With that, she had reached out and touched the thaumaturg's mind. And then she had understood. That was yesterday. You look troubled, Magistrix, said the Chancellor with concern. If there's anything I can do— Startled, the technomancer grasped her advisor's hands in her own and smiled. Oh, Luella, you have always been more a friend than a servant. And yes, there are matters of state which weigh heavy on the mind, on the soul even, but they cannot be discussed, even with a true and trusted friend such as you. She sighed. Leave me, Luella. Leave me alone with my matters of state. But Magistrix— Leave, Luella! The technomancer snapped. But she immediately regretted her outburst and laid a hand on her Chancellor's shoulder. Please? I'm sure that you want to look in on Cassandra, don't you? Thank you, Magistrix. Luella bowed before leaving the throne room. And the technomancer stared at her reflection in the window, wondering whether her mother, Hypatia, the previous technomancer, would have been proud of her. Like her mother, she wore the blue-black armor that signified her position. Over a form-fitting blue fabric undergarment that covered arms, legs and body and reached up to just under her chin. The armor was carved and contoured in an unbreakable material, reinforced by mystic wards that was patterned in thin lines of gold and silver and fanned up and out behind her head in a high collar. But unlike her mother, a stout, dour woman with jet-black hair, she was petite, with a mouth that easily formed a toothy smile and red hair piled up above her head. Gold and silver streaks, an inheritance from her paternal grandmother, crept up from her temples, adding a dignity that befitted her position and belied her youth. She had been technomancer for 3 years, and her reign had been a prosperous and peaceful one. But yesterday's news from the Hierophant suggested that this would soon come to a bitter and violent end, and not just for her. Abraxas and thaumaturgy would also fall, and the great kingdom would be engulfed in chaos. The Dark One was now among them, he whose name dare not be mentioned. His arrival had always been foretold, but the technomancer had never imagined that that day would be during her tenure. She turned from the window, intending to retire for the evening. And then the vision returned. The vision of her as a mere mortal. Steadying herself against the wall, she studied the images and shook her head in incomprehension. Her given name was Melafir. Who would dare to address her as Mel? The doctor slipped from Harker's bear hug and stared around the room in disbelief. It was now shining gold, and much, much larger. The internal walls that separated Chapel's sanctum sanctorum from his office, and his office from the desks and partitions of ACL, had vanished, creating an enormous golden chamber with a strip of window all the way round, with smooth walls and no furnishings, save the giant antelope that seemed to have survived the transition, and a heavy throne, gold, of course, in front of it. The doctor blinked rapidly, but it wasn't an hallucination. Everything had been transformed. Chapel was now dressed in a high-collared robe of shining gold, while Harker's grey suit was now gold as well, but more like armour than anything else. And although his skin was still ashen, his hair and eyes were of the same ubiquitous gold. He released the doctor and started looking around the room in confusion. The doctor ran for the stairs, only to pause as he realized that he had no idea of their location. And then he saw what appeared to be a lift, its door open and inviting. Looking back, he saw Chapel and Harker regaining their composure and realized that he had very little time and even fewer options. He ran. A second after he entered the lift, the door closed, leaving him trapped in the mirrored cubbyhole. But despite the barrel load of uncertainties that surrounded him, the doctor sighed with relief. At least the lift appeared unchanged. And then he jumped as the lift spoke to him. "Going down?" it asked in a deep but cheery voice. "What?" The doctor looked around for a loudspeaker grill, but quickly came to the conclusion that the lift really was talking to him. It just seemed the sort of thing that would happen. "I presume you came in here to go somewhere?" Might as well humor it, he decided. Yes. Ground floor, if you please." "Had enough of the Archimage and his warlord, have you?" asked the lift as it started to descend rather more rapidly than the doctor's still queasy stomach would have liked. "Archimage?" The doctor shook his head. The last thing he remembered was Chapel cackling over his gold tablet, preparing to run the Millennium Codex. Was this Sarah Quazel's age of peace and harmony? Something told him that it wasn't, and he frowned. That's the problem with quantum mnemonics, he decided. One can never be sure of the end result. Chapel had miscalculated and curdled reality, and now the doctor was going to have to sort it all out. He just hoped that the triangular barrier had held. If the mnemonic had spread, well, there was no telling the damage that could have been caused. Deciding that his first priority was to reach the sanctuary of the TARDIS and assess the extent of the problem, he suddenly realized that the lift was talking to him again. "The Archimage, glorious leader of the Oryx. Okay, I'll be blunt. He's that bloke with the grey hair and the gold cloak up on the top floor. His warlord is the thug in the armour," added the lift as it passed the 20th floor, according to the Gothic numerals which appeared in the mirrored surface. Deciding that deception was the better part of valour, the doctor agreed. Yes, but it didn't go very well, so I thought it best if I left." "Sound move," agreed the lift. "But where are you going? Are you one of the Technomancer's lot, or are you working for the Hierophant?" "Neither, I'm—" The lift stopped with a jolt. "I know you," it said. "You're the Dark One, aren't you? It's about time you arrived. That'll shake 'em up a bit." The doctor frowned. "I'm sorry, but I'm no such thing. I see. Travelling incognito? No problem." It restarted its descent. "I should have called the Time Lords in when I first detected Sarah Quazel," the doctor decided, "and let them deal with it. Now it's up to me, and I'm not sure that I can handle it." "Ground floor. He whose name dare not be mentioned." The doors opened. "What?" "Sorry. Was that a bit formal? I'll stick to Dark One if you want." The doctor stepped through the door. "Doctor, if you don't mind." "Fine, Doc, whatever you say." The doors closed behind him. "Doc," the doctor muttered. "Doc? Doc?" And then he remembered who else kept on calling him that, and looked around what had been the foyer with alarm. Where was Mel in all of this? The Archimage leant against the wall, trying to quell the nausea. He was a rational man, dismissive of the superstitions that the Technomancer and the Hierophant embraced. But omens were omens, and he remembered his great-great-grandfather's vision of cataclysm should the rulers of the great kingdom ignore the rules and strictures. They had been ignored, and then the gods had taken up arms against one another and come close to laying waste to the entire kingdom. All because the Hierophant and Technomancer of the time had broken the sacred laws. "Did you sense the god's anger, Harklan?" he asked his warlord. "Did you?" Harklan shrugged. "There was something, a spasm, a tremor." "But you are the lord here, Archimage." "Of course I am. Who else?" But as the Archimage stared out of the window, his eyes were drawn to the blinding light that burned from the geometric center of the great kingdom. The tabernacle, home of the gods. To approach the tabernacle was the greatest crime in the kingdom, upheld by all three states. The last recorded incursion was over 10 generations ago, when a warrior Auric had led his tribe to confront the gods. No punishment at earthly hands had been necessary, however, since the gods themselves were more than capable of defending themselves. The foolhardy Oryx had burnt in supernal fire, a terrifying lesson to would-be heretics. But the Archimage knew far more than he had told his duplicitous warlord. His spies and eavesdroppers about the great kingdom had informed him of the Hierophant's blasphemous contact with the Technomancer, and the thaumaturg in question had been apprehended leaving the ziggurat. The interrogation had been a short-lived but satisfying pleasure for the Archimage, not the thaumaturg, and the information he had provided had been well worth the messy inconvenience. He whose name dare not be mentioned was abroad in the kingdom, and if the ancient tomes were to be believed, this was the first sign of the impending war of the gods. But the Dark One was claimed to be a man of great power. If his powers could disrupt the kingdom, who could say what would happen if he allied himself with one of the lords of that kingdom? Turning from the window, the Archimage approached his throne. He had every intention of being that lord, because only he had the strength and vision to unite the kingdom as it had never been united before, and he was sure that his god, Saraquazel, would look upon his plans with beneficence. So why did the Archimage shudder when he looked at the tabernacle? The gold and marble splendour of the foyer had been one thing. What passed for London was another. Standing in front of what had been number 1, Canada Square, virtually unchanged, save its unsurprising golden sheen and incandescent light atop the pyramidal roof, the doctor placed his hands on his hips and surveyed the landscape. He had already analysed the blindingly azure sky, alive with silent electric storms, and decided that he was looking at the physical manifestation of Chapel's mnemonic barrier. In front of him, old Father Thames flowed with its usual sluggishness, but the waters were full of dark shapes that were definitely not salmon. As he watched, a dragon-like head cleared the surface, bellowing plaintively before diving below. The doctor frowned. The last time anything like that had been swimming in the Thames, it had been the Zygon's bio-engineered Scaracin. And then a screech from above drew his attention. Craning his neck, he could just make out a flock of birds, but then he realized that they weren't birds. Cast in gold with bat-like wings and devil's tails, they were airborne bipeds. He shuddered. Was he the only person in London unaffected by the transformation? He looked at his immediate surroundings. Strangely enough, the pavement and its associated furnishings were physically unchanged. Lampposts, litter bins, parking meters, but they were a curious translucent grey, as if the life had been sucked out of them, leaving only husks. Even the boats moored in the stretch of the Thames opposite the tower were the same, desiccated grey, bobbing on top of the monster-filled waters. Quantum mnemonics was a subject about which he was woefully ignorant, along with virtually everyone else in the cosmos, he reassured himself. But the doctor wondered whether the peculiar transformation of the tower's surroundings was due to their proximity to the source of the codex. Deciding that this was a trite and simplistic answer, he filed the problem away for future analysis. It was time to find the TARDIS, and hopefully a way out of this nightmare. And then he thought about Mel again, and wondered what had happened to her in this new reality. Leaning back in her throne, Melifere sent out a mental summons for her confidants. What she was about to do was both heretical and extremely dangerous, and she needed the counsel of her friends. "Magistrix!" The chorus of voices interrupted her. "Ah, my Chancellor and Major Domo. Please approach the throne." She watched them as they walked towards her. Blonde Luella, always a rich source of gossip about the private lives of the Cybrids, and Bartholomew. Ah, dear Bartholomew, she thought warmly. Once Luella had been made human, the technomancer had soon realized that her newly inaugurated Chancellor needed a suitable companion. Knowing that her Chancellor had a fondness for the tubby Cybrid who waited on table, Melifere had elevated him to humanity, and his gift of humour had been a welcome addition to a court that had for so long been arid of mirth, save the tired old jokes of General Gargill, commander of Melifere's Cybrid army, and any laughter he elicited was more due to respect than amusement. Melifere had turned a blind eye to both of her courtiers' indulgences. Luella enjoyed breathing the noxious fumes produced by burning the leaves of the plants that flourished on the banks of the great river, as did Bartholomew, who also drank far too deeply and frequently of the royal cellars. But these indiscretions were soon overshadowed by a far greater crime. Luella had become with child. The laws of the great kingdom were strict upon this point. The only humans permitted to breed were the members of the first families, whose humanity could be traced back to the formation of the kingdom. Elevated creatures were forbidden to procreate. The penalty was death. And so the technomancer had spent countless hours in silent meditation with her goddess, the Lady TARDIS, before deciding their fate. And that fate was a merciful one, for the Lady TARDIS had told her, in a vision, as is the way of these things, that the child must live, for it would play a role in the days to come. She stared into her courtier's eyes with a final doubt as to whether she could trust them. But if she couldn't trust them, who could she trust? The Dark One? She laughed, and was forced to ignore the quizzical look from Bartholomew and Luella. As you are both aware, I had a visitor yesterday. They nodded. That visitor was an emissary from the Hierophant. A thaumaturg, gasped Luella. But the laws of the kingdom... The technomancer raised her hand. I am familiar with the laws, Luella. I am also familiar with the legends of the kingdom. The thaumaturg informed me that the Dark One, he whose name dare not be mentioned, is abroad in the kingdom. Bartholomew's eyes widened. The end of the world, he muttered. The wall of tears will crumble, and the barbarians will invade. Well quoted, my major domo, said Melifere. The kingdom faces its greatest crisis, and in times such as these, I am forced to consider actions that would once have been unthinkable. I must speak to the Hierophant. She observed the horrified reactions with not a little satisfaction. If she was going to commit blasphemy, she would rather it felt like she was going to commit blasphemy, and their shocked looks did exactly that. But that means going into the labyrinth, Luella exclaimed. The laws are an artifice to bind the kingdom in peace, my Chancellor. If the kingdom is to stave off destruction, the laws must be bent, broken even. She gestured towards the view of the kingdom. I depart for the labyrinth within the hour, and I would be grateful of companionship. She waited as her words sank in, and the result was hardly unexpected. If the Magistrix wants companionship, then we will be honored, stated Bartholomew. Honored, repeated Luella. Then it is settled, said the technomancer, rising from the throne. Change into your travelling clothes and meet me at the great doors in 30 minutes. They reached the doors of the throne room before Melifere could humble herself sufficiently to say her next words. Thank you. They were embarking upon a journey with deadly ramifications. It was the least she could say. The Archimage stared out of the window at the shining heart of the great kingdom and frowned. Beyond the confines of the tower, the Dark One roamed the kingdom, and the Archimage needed to find him before the others did. His usual techniques were useless. The Dark One was shielded from the gaze of the Archimage's aurics, including the winged ones who wheeled about the sky. The Dark One could even breach the walls of the tower before the Archimage sensed him, and that would be far too late. He needed an advantage, and the only one that he could think of lay within the tabernacle. He needed to consult Sarah Quazelle. His mind reached out to the auric that tended his meagre library. If only he could access the great works within the labyrinth as easily, he thought wistfully, and directed it to a beige-bound volume. The volume had been written by the vizier to the Archimage's great-great-grandfather, who had transcribed it from tablets of stone that were purported to have come from the other great kingdom, the one that fell beneath the sea, and apparently contained an incantation capable of protecting one from the wrath of the gods, dare they approach the tabernacle. The Archimage just hoped that it worked as well as the legends claimed. The more the doctor saw, the more worried he became. From his brief observations, what had been London was now a triangle about a mile on each side, bounded by a golden Canary Wharf tower, a blue, silver and gold ziggurat that was presumably once the Millennium Hall, and grey Fiats that could only be what remained of the Library of St. John the Beheaded. Within the triangle, he could see 3 separate encampments with 3 contrasting building styles, little blue-black pyramids, gold blocks, and Fiat grey constructs suggesting underground dwellings. All well and good, but there was a problem. The closer the doctor looked, the more of each type he could see. It was as if the mnemonic had made up for the lack of 3-dimensional space in the new London by fractaling reality, folding and cracking space to fit more in. The doctor turned away. The artificial city of Castrovalva, with its complete lack of internal logic, had been bad enough, when only the laws of distance and perspective had been shattered. But Castrovalva had been created by the master using block transfer computations. This farrago was the direct consequence of Chapel's quantum mnemonic, and far more sinister. As for the shining white light that stood at the heart of the three encampments, well, the closer he had looked at that, the larger and more awesome it had become. Shivering, he turned his back on it to face the outer reaches of the new London. The last time he had seen the TARDIS, it had been in the shadow of Nelson's column. And while Trafalgar Square had originally lain within the triangle that Chapel's barrier had enclosed, the Codex had turned everything inside out. The buildings that had once been tourist landmarks now filled the space between the triangle and the scintillating energy barrier. But they hadn't escaped the transformation either. St. Paul's Cathedral, Telecom Tower, Big Ben, and, of course, Nelson's column. All were dark and distorted, nightmare mirror images designed by architects from the depths of Bedlam, their silhouettes clear against the actinic blue of the barrier. St. Paul's dome was lopsided and melted, with twisted fungal growths reaching up from the top of the dome to the bright blue sky. The regular spires of the Palace of Westminster were now bent corkscrews, pointing in every direction. And Telecom Tower was now a pinnacle of darkened deformity, like a decaying asparagus spear. As for Nelson's column, instead of the Doctor's old friend, a vile representation of the human figure surmounted the pillar, a distillation of corruption that leered at the horrific transformation of London. The Doctor shuddered and immediately wondered why such immature imagery was occurring to him. This was all in a day's work, surely. And then a gnawing doubt surfaced. Had he really ridden the mnemonic unscathed? He quelled the worry and set off for the warped version of Nelson's column. He would soon be back in the TARDIS, where he would get some answers. But another worry immediately surfaced to replace it. For the first time in ages, he couldn't sense the TARDIS in his mind. "They're coming." The Hierophant tapped her hand on the wooden desk and looked up at Atos, the thaumaturg that attended her. In the past, she had considered raising both Atos and her warlord Elaine to humanity, in the same way that the Archimage and the Technomancer had with their chosen ones, but had dismissed it as a wasteful indulgence. But during the dark hours of the previous day, freshly burdened with the knowledge that he whose name dare not be mentioned was stalking the kingdom, she had pondered the wisdom of her decision, desperately yearning for an intellectual equal with whom she could discuss the situation. "What of the Archimage, O Bibliotrix?" asked Atos in his thin, uncertain voice. "His presence is unnecessary. The Technomancer and myself can deal with the danger that threatens the kingdom." The thaumaturg simply nodded, and the Hierophant again wondered what it would be like to have some intelligent conversation for a change. "I'll find out soon," she said aloud, prompting and ignoring a strange look from the thaumaturg. And then she thought about the Technomancer's ungrounded hatred of her. Information passed along through her network of informants, and sighed. Such emotions would have to be overcome if they were to stand any hope of saving the kingdom. "Leave me," she ordered, and watched as Atos nervously tottered towards the door. Maybe a confidant would have been a good idea, but could she have spoken of the deeper fears that concerned her? Could she have told them of her conviction that she had brought the disaster upon them all? She rose and stared at her reflection in the polished tabletop. As hard as it was to admit, age had not given her dignity, only hardness, emphasized by her severely back-combed grey hair. All the warmth and love that she had possessed in her youth was gone, spent on her ungrateful children, leaving only bitterness and regrets, and her subterranean labyrinth of thaumaturgy. And if the prophecies concerning the Dark One were to be believed, even that would soon be taken from her. Luella and Bartholomew were dressed in only marginally less grand versions of the blue armor that the Technomancer wore, armor that would expand to cover and protect them at a single mental command. Such measures were necessary when leaving the sanctuary of the Ziggurat and braving the great kingdom. Even the Cybrids could be vicious if caught unawares. "Are you both sure of this endeavor?" asked Melifere. They were standing on the steps that led from the Ziggurat into the world of the Hybrids, with their pyramid dwellings and campfires and primitive ways. Her Chancellor and her Major Domo had family in the dwellings, but now was not the time to visit them. Melifere had another route in mind. "Magistrix, you cannot travel abroad without protection," stated Bartholomew. "As we said earlier, it is an honor to serve." According to the ancient rites. General Gargill should have been sufficient as her honour guard, but Melifere had decided that she didn't really have the stomach for his blood and thunder approach. Luella and Bartholomew were infinitely better company. Yet the old doubts were still there. She had raised them to humanity. Was their obedience true, or was it nothing more than a legacy of their transformation? Then again, given the current circumstances, any loyalty was better than nothing. "Very well," she announced. "We proceed towards the labyrinth, but I suggest we travel via the wretched wastes. If my people see that the technomancer has left the ziggurat, they will draw their own conclusions, and I cannot afford for unrest to ferment. When the dark times are upon us, we shall need our unity." She looked beyond the simplistic dwellings of her cybrids, towards the grey, melted buildings that lay between the great kingdom and the Wall of Tears. The region was swarming with renegades of all three castes, but their violence was mollified by the fact that they were forced to live together. And besides, the technomancer wielded enough power to vanquish any foe. Melifere set off down the steps, Luella and Bartholomew a respectful distance behind, and turned to face the thin, foggy barrier that separated her realm from the wastes. Legend had it that the wretched wastes were all that remained of the civilization that had lived before the gods had created the kingdom. Passing through it would be a fortifying reminder of the horrors that would descend should the Dark One succeed. The doctor stopped in his tracks. Within seconds of turning his back on the settlement area, he had passed through a wall of light mist, only to discover that the entire environment had altered. The azure glow of the energy barrier had darkened to virtually purple, casting sinister shadows off the deformed buildings and making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He shook his head. The mnemonic had well and truly altered the local properties of the space-time continuum, and the rational part of his mind wondered how stable it all was. The way things were currently going, it wouldn't have surprised him if the whole lot collapsed on top of him. In a metaphysical sense, of course. And then it would take a lot more than a respiratory bypass system to save him. He stroked the surface of the building alongside him. Warm to the touch, it resembled crumbling grey marble. Whereas the area surrounding Canary Wharf Tower looked as if the life had been sucked out of it, the desolation of these wretched wastes suggested that decay had set in. The doctor froze. How had he known that the borders of the Great Kingdom were called the Wretched Wastes? How had he known it was called the Great Kingdom, come to that? Shaking his head, he filed it away alongside the ever-increasing number of questions that he wanted answers for. Continuing his stroll, he peered up at the looming grey edifices, trying to keep track of Nelson's column. Of course, he thought worriedly, there was no guarantee that the TARDIS was still in the same relative location, but without his usual instinct, it was all he had to go on. The idea that the Millennium Codex had affected it was too terrifying to contemplate unless absolutely necessary. He stopped again. Although his Time Lord senses might be dulled, his more pedestrian ones were as keen as ever, and the irregular scuttling noise behind him was undeniably the sound of being followed. He increased his pace through the meandering alleyways, but heard his pursuer speed up accordingly. His brisk walk became a run. His multicolored coat flapping behind him, he swerved down a tiny turning, hoping that it wasn't a dead end. It wasn't. He was in an open courtyard, flanked on both sides by dark stone griffins, this London's Landseer lions, he guessed, and directly in front of him, the base of an enormous pillar thrust from the ground, its surface encrusted with what looked like stone fungus. But it was the object next to it that cheered the doctor's heart. The resolute blue shape of the TARDIS, apparently unchanged by the mnemonic. His relief was knocked out of him by whatever leapt onto his back. From the dark blue talons that were reaching for his face, the doctor assumed that it was one of Louise's demons. A cybrid, he knew with certainty. He struggled, but the cybrid was tenacious and prematurely strong, and its arms, slowly but unbreakably, reached round his shoulders. The glistening tips of the talons were only inches from his face when he threw himself backwards onto the courtyard floor. The impact dislodged the cybrid, and the doctor jumped to his feet. Realizing that the loud crack he had heard must have been the creature's back breaking. As he reached the doors of the TARDIS and fumbled for the key, he realized that there was silence behind him. Turning, he was relieved to see that the cybrid was unmoving, but the faint noises from just down the alleyway indicated that it hadn't been alone. Still, he'd be safe enough in the TARDIS, he reminded himself, inserting the key. Nothing happened. The key refused to turn. He remembered the countless defenses that he had installed over the centuries to prevent unauthorized entry, the 22 tumbler lock, the metabolism sensor, the isomorphic controls. None of them would have proved a barrier to him. He tried again, but it was as if the lock had been changed. Could the quantum mnemonic have warped the block transfer computations that drove the TARDIS's police box shell, effectively jamming the doors? The scraping and scuttling was getting closer, and he turned the key again in desperation. As he prepared to attempt direct communication with the TARDIS telepathic circuits by laying his hands on the doors, a booming concussion made him step back. In time with the pulsing roof light, a trumpeting roar began to echo around the courtyard. "No!" he screamed, banging on the doors, which were rapidly becoming insubstantial. "You can't leave me!" But his next impact never connected. He sprawled forward into the space where the TARDIS had once been, but was no longer. As his bewilderment turned into panic, he suddenly saw that he had a more immediate problem. 5 more cybrids were crouched in front of him, chewing on the lumps of meat that hung from their drooling mouths, but their slitted amber eyes were focused on him. And beyond them lay the half-eaten carcass of their colleague, its face a rictus of posthumous satisfaction.